My name is Brock, and this is the Dungeon Master's Toolkit podcast. On today's episode, I talked to Jesse T. William about homebrewing creatures and classes. These are designed for 5th edition, but a lot of the design that we talk about is narrative focused, so it should work in just about any system. If you'd like to help us make more content, consider joining the Patreon. You can also bookmark our affiliate links to Amazon and DriveThruRPG to support the show with each purchase. Want a free way to help the show? Give it a review on your favorite podcast platform, or like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Finally, if you'd like to be on the show, or think you know a great guest, contact me on the Discord server or on Twitter. And with that, let's jump into the episode. Welcome, everybody. Today I have Jesse T. William with me again. Welcome, Jesse.
Thank you for having me.
Jesse was on episode 60, so if you'd like to hear more about him, you can go check out that episode. But today we're going to talk a little bit about homebrew and the process of designing for homebrew. So with that, Jesse, I'll let you kind of take it away.
Hell yeah. Well, yeah, I think so. All of the things I do in D&D since the start have been homebrew. I've always been very reluctant to use other people's like content or even like not look at the monster manual, but like take a lot from the monster manual outside of dragons. I have a sort of obsession with originality that has kind of led me down this path of forcing myself to homebrew. I've designed a couple of classes and I'm working on some others. And I've also designed a number of dozens of homebrew creatures. Is there like a specific point of interest you want to start with those?
Let's start with monsters and then maybe get into classes second.
Hell yeah. Yeah. So when I started, I think I really hit a big stride when I started doing the professional GM thing. Because for these games, it was kind of almost like a point of escalation of like through my games, I wanted things to be more meaningful and more interesting. And so typically the way I run my games or like structure a campaign is that there's some kind of big existential threat that like bleeds out into a bunch of different aspects. Typically, it's some kind of abyssal or infernal plane. And so what I figured out was struggling with was how to tell a story through the monsters and creatures that are expressed from that aren't just like, well, here's a fight. Like what do we sort of learn about these things? So in the biggest kind of series of campaigns I run, which I have 8 games running a week in, the central like conflict or I guess the big bad is this like plane of lies. So in my world, there are 3 parts of the Feywild. There's the infernal side of the Feywild, which is the plane of lies. There's the Feywild and the like celestial side of the Feywild. So a lot of the campaign centers around what if fairies were worse, or at least as far as some of the monsters go. There are a lot more layers to it, but in this storytelling, they're central to the design is the question of, well, what does it mean to be from a plane of lies? So we talked a bit about the eyeless imposter last time. And did I talk a lot about the Wailing Monarch as well?
I don't remember that one. It was the eyeless imposter and then the deceitful traveler.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So with the design, it's like, well, how do I take this idea of lying and kind of extend it out into a longer story? Because with the monsters, what I really want to do is tell a story. I'm not interested in having a super hard fight, but I'd rather have something that'll be memorable for the players. So using this idea of lying, we'll take the eyeless imposter if I can remember clearly enough. But yeah, it centers around its stories, as we talked about, this idea of it like impersonating someone. It's what's the word? Impersonating, imposter, same thing. So it like kills a person and takes their identity in an isolated place and then prevents the individuals who knew that initial person from realizing that it is an imposter. So the story is always exploring and like uncovering what that lie is. The players typically would either encounter like the discarded body of the individual who was replaced by the imposter, or encountering the individuals who are kept alive by the imposter who have their eyes removed, which I think rather than just go ahead and like initiate a combat, I think that raises an interesting question of like, well, why are their eyes removed, right? Their rate baked in is a mystery. And so they begin to prod on that. And, they'll find that as the eyeless imposter is this like non-human creature who is like trying to take care of these people, they'll realize the problem in the people's like diet and health, and like they've been eating like leather or something, like something weird that they don't understand as this sort of mystery builds. And secondary to that, there's also this sense of shame from the eyeless imposter, which I found like really important to the idea of its design, and how I want it to behave, and if people were to use it, how I'd want them to use it. And I think that was sort of one aspect, this idea of like, maybe not what it means to be like a liar, but like how you explore the different like character flaws that come from having to lie a lot. And so again, as I think we talked about, I'm going off of a very busy memory, but the only way to kill the eyeless imposter is to like force it to force it to look upon its victims. So hopefully, and I've run it twice so far in game, and it's worked out pretty well so far. But the idea is that you kind of seed within the party this mystery, or this hint of like shame and how it behaves. And then when they finally kill it, or like reduce it to 0 hit points, and it doesn't go away immediately, hopefully they can, with some hints, of course, from the DM after the fact, like come to a satisfying conclusion of revealing it, or figuring out making it look upon its victims, and having that reveal be the, I don't know, culmination of the story. But I think the again, the purpose of that is to try to achieve, rather than have the players in the moment like get reduced to 0 hit points, or knocked unconscious or kill them, have them think about what it means that this creature is around. Because I think there's like maybe 8 or 9 creatures that I designed so far from this plane of lies. And yeah, how I would hope that like I've done my job correctly. Although, when players have divine sense and things like that, they get to pick up a little more information of like, oh, it's Infernal Fae, that's weird. But hopefully they like pick up the themes before they like the explicit knowledge of oh, it's a god of lies, or the creatures that are made of deceit that are invading, or crossing through at this point.
So it really sounds like you kind of pick, a theme for your creatures, and then you kind of go down the rabbit hole of asking questions. Well, what and why would this creature act a certain way, or
Yeah,
whatever?
yeah, and it's really on the nature of like lying as well, because oftentimes, the first thing, a party will ask, or depending on the party, but there are these like cultists in this setting that work for lies, and the first thing that they ask is like, well, why are you doing this? Like, what's the motivation? And it's a really like, when you have a thing that's just about lying, it's like, well, like, why are they lying? But when it comes to the creatures, like designing, so I'll talk a bit about the Wailing Monarch, which is a really nasty one, but a really exciting one as well. I think there's a sort of just pure like malevolent and like chaotic evil kind of aspect to lying. Like there really is, oftentimes it is to serve a purpose, and it's self-serving. But I think there's also an aspect to some people who just lie just because they can, and exploring the more like, I suppose, psychopathic area of that. And I think the Wailing Monarch is one of my favorite creature designs for that, because it's just pure evil. I think the way I'll introduce it to you, I'll go through the sort of story of how I typically introduce it to a group of players. I think the best way is to, have them enter a town. A lot of people are dead or severely injured. And so immediately there's a question of like, well, what happened? Who came through here? And the answer, the first kind of weird thing that they encounter is that, well, we did this to ourselves. The Wailing Monarch, it took a bit of inspiration from a episode of a show called Love, Death, and Robots. I can't recall if I made it around the same time or after, but once I made the connection, there's essentially this monster in one of the episodes that like is this water spirit that like sings this song, or like screams or something, and like draws people into the water and makes them drown and makes them go crazy. So essentially the Wailing Monarch is like it looks like a person, and it is very intelligent. It's very deceitful. It has like a plus 14 or something. It has like expertise in deception. And the idea is that someone will find it in the middle of like the woods or something, and it will, again, it looks like a person and it will be feigning injury. And so it kind of preys on the good instincts of people, where it will kind of, without even like talking, it'll pretend to be like, hazy or confused, and it will be taken hopefully to a place where it can be helped, in really big quotations there. That is ideally a population center. And then it will let out this scream, and anyone who can hear the scream or is like within range, like can hear it in their mind, is forced to make a intelligence saving throw or begin to take actions to harm themselves. But with the design of the creature, I didn't want it to just be a like stop at that. Like once you kill it, it's done. I wanted it to begin to be more layered. And even in the storytelling of like, well, if that's the case, why are there survivors? How do you even find people after it's been through a town? Because like the DC I think is 19. So a couple of rounds of that, and most people are like commoners are going to be dead even if they do make a save. So I think the first thing I thought was important to this creature was to have, once someone saves from its whale, that they can never be affected again by this specific monarch. So you get a bit, start to develop this kind of like survivor story from it. But then also it gives the players an edge in combat once they do succeed. Secondary to this thing, very similar to the Eyeless Imposter, is that once it's reduced to 0 hit points, it doesn't die. So the players begin to learn about the wailing monarch. It's very evil. It hurts people. They go out and find it, track it down, have their fight. It's really tough. It has I think legendary actions and resistances, and it's pretty like limiting for a party. It's gonna stop a lot of people from acting pretty consistently. But then once it's dead, it doesn't stop screaming. So then the players are faced with the secondary thing of like, well, how do we get rid of this screaming thing? Because if anyone comes into contact with it, chances are that they're just going to die. Hopefully, at this point, the party had all made their intelligence saves, and so I've used this against one of my parties, and it took them, I think, 4 to 5 encounters to actually finish it. Because what happens when the Wailing Monarch isn't killed is that something called the Wailing Knight essentially chased down the party with the head of the Wailing Monarch, which is still screaming, until the deed is done. And the deed is like the way to kill it is just to submerge the head in water. So like I think, given the chaotic nature of most parties, my thought there being that maybe 30% of the time someone would try to stick the head in water and find out it's successful, or throw it down a well or something. But the other 70% of the time, the Wailing Monarch comes, or the Wailing Knight rather, comes and attempts to force the party to deal with the situation. But there is at least a hint in which whoever slayed the monarch or landed the killing blow receives a vision of the Wailing Knight, which is like a 10-foot tall creature as well, like full clad in armor and carries this huge axe, kneeling in a spring that is nearby and then standing up. And then the vision ends and the Wailing Knight is on the hunt. And I think when they first kill the Wailing Knight, it's also a creature that doesn't die until the Wailing Monarch dies. So again, the party will receive, or someone, whoever killed it, receives a vision of the Wailing Knight kneeling back down in the spring. And then after 24 hours, they receive another vision. So the party that dealt with this had to kill the Wailing Knight 3 or 4 times before they figured out the puzzle. And I think that was honestly partially because they had a lot of things to do in the game, but also partially their fault for not really thinking about it too much. But I found a lot of fun and success in the design of that.
And what was the kind of tension at the table with them repeatedly having this like same or similar encounter and fight.
Each successive time that they dealt with it was more inconvenient than the last. So when they first dealt with the Wailing Monarch, they were rescuing one of the party members' fathers from the Plane of Lies, and essentially like the Wailing Monarch was just left alone as kind of like a guard dog. So they dealt with it with the help of some high level NPCs. It was a complicated encounter, so that was kind of brushed over, and then they were on their way to negotiate a or attempts to negotiate a peace, and they're in this little town and hear like heavy footsteps, and they see this like large figure looming outside the tavern, and they're with a number of important NPCs, and then it pulls out the head of the Wailing Monarch, and all of the NPCs, who admittedly are like leveled and safe, start hurting themselves. And because the party had already succeeded most of their saving throws, they get into action. They deal with it, but they still had to go straight to this peace meeting. So the peace meeting happens. It doesn't go well. There's an attack in the streets of the city that they are now trying to flee. And the Wailing Knight shows up again. The street is sent into chaos and they have to deal with it. And the final time they dealt with it was during a battle. So this thing had been escalating. The peace talks didn't go well, came to a very brutal battle. And in the middle of the battle, marching through the canopy or through the tree line towards the front lines, this 10-foot tall, armor clad giant knight thing with this huge axe making a beeline towards the party with the head of this Wailing Monarch. And it was only once they used so in this specific circumstance, they were very lucky because the in the battle, their forces were outnumbered, and part of the plan was to like set the field on fire and kind of like make everyone who was wearing heavy armor on the other side have a really hard time wearing that heavy armor in the heat, both in the like hot climate of where they were at and like the added heat of the fire. So when they cast an ice spell at the Wailing Knight, I took the opportunity to be like, well, you see the like as the ice turns to water and then to steam, seems to like mark the head of the monarch, and then they cast create or destroy water around the head and stopped it. But yeah, it was a point of like they they were already having a really hard time in that battle and had like another encounter to do directly after it. So by the once they solved the puzzle, they were really like I think relieved. But even like I remember the night before and giving it was the cleric who had killed it the last time. So giving the cleric a vision of like, well, you see the Wailing Knight standing up from its spring, and the whole party just being like, shit, 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 shit. It was really fun.
Yeah, that sounds like a pretty terrifying creature to come up against. I just, if you don't figure it out how to kill it, that it's just going to keep being a problem until you sit down and deal with it, essentially.
Yeah, yeah, it was definitely a very inconvenient time for them. I'll also say real quick, just a fun note of design for the Wailing Knight, because aside from once you've encountered once you are set up to encounter the Wailing Knight, the like aspects of the Wailing Monarch that were a problem aren't really a problem anymore because everyone's made their save. They're immune to the whale. But I gave the knight a really fun ability, which is to like because it's so tall, it like kicks people over with its legendary actions, and if it knocks someone prone, it'll use its next legendary action to stomp on them for like a pretty large amount of damage. So it became a really fun layer to combat of like when people are getting kicked over, before the Wailing Knight can act with its next legendary action, having a player, hopefully with enough strength, like pull their party member out from underneath the boot that's coming down. But yeah, no, it was memorable, I hope, for the party.
Kind of a fun setup mechanic there to put them in a tough spot that they need to get out of before, or they have a chance to get out of it before they take damage.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think you mentioned on the last episode, but these features and stuff are available on your Patreon,
Yeah,
correct?
yeah. So the last episode, I was just in the process of working on filling out basically a compendium of all of the things I've designed for my games. So I think right now there are four like four or five kinds of creatures from different planes in my world that all have like different stories attached to them, and the most fleshed out are these infernal fey creatures. But then I also have, just in this like large compendium that I'm trying to update, hopefully once a month, all of the, or not all of them, but a couple of classes that are in various stages of development for me, as well as a number of magic items which are ultra specific to my world and how I run things. So I don't know how great they'll be for other people's games, but at least we'll give some ideas. But the creatures I think are worth looking at.
And this might be a good time to talk about those classes that you're working on.
Yeah, yeah. I have the great luck that I'm very lucky to have two players in my games who are currently play testing some, and both. Oh, actually, that's not true. Sorry, getting ahead of myself. But yeah, so available right now. One is called the Arcanite, and it is basically like a wizard paladin, and taking the kind of structure of a paladin with their lay on hands, and I believe I use the idea of channel divinity to provide structure for how I design the class. Basically, one of the core features of the class is they have this thing called a flow of magic, and so when I think, or I'll back up a little bit here, but when I'm designing a class or a creature, I'm very focused on either a story or a visual aspect of what the thing is doing. So in the case of the flow of magic, I kind of had this idea that what if rather than learning these specific spells and these specific components, you just kind of focused in on one area of magic and be kind of not, if you were just more used to or become more tuned to doing a couple of specific things. So the idea I think for the flow of magic is this very physical thing that the Arcanites do. So my favorite class is the Abjurist, and they use their flow of magic to use their reactions most typically to reduce damage. So there's a limit to how much they can use at a time, but the general idea being that in the higher levels of the class, anyone within 30 feet of them, when they take a hit, the Abjurist Arcanite can like use a reaction, throw up a hand, and in the same vein of a shield, throw up like a certain amount of like a damage buffer to hopefully stop a party member from going down or whatever the circumstances. But the idea was always like this, designing all these subclasses like very very visual. There's another one which is I think called a diviner, and I when I was visualizing that, I think they're kind of specialize on the idea of like twisting fate on the battlefield, very much like the divination wizard, but again more like acutely. So rather than having portent rolls, they use their flow of magic, and they have to use 5 points at a time, and they can only use like 2 points per their level at a time. But if they have 5 points available, they can change a saving throw up or down by one number, which in many cases can be the difference between life and death. And then at higher levels, of course, when they have just more available to them, they can get up to like 3-4 points. But of course, it's a very limited resource, so it's the uses of it are important. But yeah, I just kind of like the idea of, rather than like casting these complicated spells, although they still have that, again, like half casters, the idea of them like reaching out and kind of like, if you have a game where you interpret magic as the weave, like kind of tapping into the weave and moving with it and adjusting things on the battlefield. So that's one aspect of it. If you have any, I will begin to rant about the storytelling side of things for another class, but I'll shut up for a second if you have any things you want to focus in on there.
I don't think much other than it's a completely new class. It's with its own subclasses then.
Yes, yeah, yeah. I can't, again, with the sort of obsession with, I don't know, like being unique, I suppose. I'm hesitant to even use the word original. I couldn't even bring myself to attempt to design subclasses for already existing classes. But yeah, so then the storytelling aspect of it. I have a player playtesting a class called a shape changer. And the idea, or the fundamental kind of like vision for the class being the kind of werewolf stand-in, or the like even perhaps like a Hulk kind of stand-in, with the story of the class being one of having this inner conflict. So how I represented that within the mechanics became, I suppose maybe the central question I was asking myself is like, how do I make this from a character standpoint? How do I make the character kind of feel bad having this class while still having the player kind of have fun with it? And the primary thing is using a mechanic around their hit dice. So the hit dice for this class are D12, and they can at second level can change shape into whatever subclass they take, and there's obviously room for them to flavor it as they like. Although it's not on my Patreon right now. I'm sure by the time this episode is posted, I'll have it up. But they can change into like a devil or a demon or just a general beast like thing, leaving those kind of aspects vague. Right, it's back to the hit dice. But yeah, the central kind of mechanics of the class are based around the hit dice and them not being able to regain hit dice on long rests, but rather being able to use their hit dice during combat to heal themselves up and then regaining them on short rests. And the vision I kind of wanted to create with that is when the party beds down for their long rest, it's been a tough day. The shape changer character, rather than bedding down with everyone else for their long rests, takes a short rest, gets an amount of hit dice back, and then is forced to go into their shape changed form to heal themselves and then do a short rest again and have a night of them just kind of like alone away from the party in this kind of like physical sense of suffering, while also like trying not to penalize people for not taking long rests. So they also like can only take 1 point of exhaustion, because I feel like if I didn't include that in the design of the class, if this were to be released, or if the public were to take to this, you would definitely have DMs who were like seeking to punish players at any point possible and being like, well, you haven't been able to long rest and it's been constant combat. So you have 4 points of exhaustion. You're no longer mechanically viable. But yeah, so I'm really excited about that class as well, and the storytelling potential of it.
So the shape changer is almost like kind of the idea of like a werewolf type character, right? That's struggling with this form that's kind of not necessarily controlling them, but is a big part of them.
Yeah, yeah. And it's even to the point where it is like the subclass that you take at level 1 is called your blood curse. Like, what is your blood curse? So very specific in the language of the features of the class is the idea that this is not a you're not like a cool barbarian or a blessed paladin or even like a clever warlock. You're like, I'm cursed. I'm having a bad time. But yeah, and then like with the features of the class as it progresses on, aside from the specificity of whatever blood curse you have, the main line of features that you get from the class are called abnormal manifestations, where your body, even outside of its shape changed form, will begin to change. And so, in the main kind of thing is that you get, rather than having to use weapons, you can just use your hands and as like claws, and again like leaving it vague enough so that the players can what's it called, like in leave room for their own characterization, whether their non-shape changed form is just has like maybe long nails that they use as claws, or are like full like proper claws. Yes, where was I talking about abnormal manifestations? But yeah, as the class progresses with these abnormal manifestations, the person outside of their shape changed form becomes more and more inhuman. And I think there's a sort of like tragedy within the class that is like causing this isolation. And eventually, around 14th or 15th level, your shape changed form is your original human form, and your base form is your like class, is whatever like thing. So rather than being a person who changes into a werewolf once a day, you're a werewolf who occasionally can change into a person. And the 20th level ability is called Lose Control, in which they get like I think 2 extra attacks or something in their round. But then once combat is over, they have to start making wisdom saves to change back into a person. And the idea is that again, just they lost control. They like lost themselves and were just a beast or a devil or something, whatever the subclass is, and then are forced to like reconcile that with staying in their human form for an hour, however long it is.
I like the design and kind of the thought behind it. For one, hit dice don't tend to get used a lot or have a lot of
Yeah.
uses. So it's neat to see that as a resource. And then I think that the kind of the like almost negative aspect of, or like the negative implications of choosing this class gives you a lot more story hooks or ways to hook into and cause complications, which I think is good because that hooks the players into the story a little bit more and kind of what's going on. And I think I've seen people talk about the warlock as being one of those classes as well, where having that, like having your patron just baked into the class then provides the DM ways to kind of influence things a little bit more than you can with other classes,
Yeah.
right? And having this like curse gives you kind of just more, I don't want to say control, but it feels like it's going to provide opportunities for interesting gameplay.
Yeah, I would hope that with the class is provided a structure or a story or even just like a loose outline of again like this curse is going to get worse. And I think it's similar to warlocks, or especially with people who are connected to like the undead and the great old ones and the fiends of like I think there'd be motivation for the characters to be like, how do I get rid of this pact? How do I get rid of this curse? I like the idea of a sort of like reluctance of ability, but also having a powerful ability as well, something that's very useful. I think that's the one thing that I'm still kind of working on in the design of the class is the balance of its ability, because as hit dice at lower levels, I ran a combat last night with the one player who was playtesting this class, and there are a couple of things I'm already noticing, which is like when you have the ability to heal yourself, you become more self-reliant, and it means you expend your resources quicker. So while the other party member, they've saved their spell slots, they're level 3, they save their spell slots, have their things, this player has used his three main resources. And then additionally, with the nature of the storytelling of the class, I think it's very easy to like put yourself in a corner of like, well, cool. So in this case, this player is changes into a big crystalline devil, and they had a combat 2 minutes outside of a town, but then combat ends. The current running mechanic is that every time they use their hit dice, they are forced to stay in their shape changed form for 10 minutes. In his shape changed form as a crystalline devil for 30 minutes. And it's kind of like stuck waiting outside the town, which isn't, the end of the world, because 30 minutes in D&D time can be brushed over pretty quickly. But if you're in kind of a tight spot like they are, where they're kind of between, we have the town that's 2 minutes away, but also we're in this cave. And if we stay in this cave, things are going to keep coming out of the cave and attacking us. So it puts a very complex kind of natural, I suppose, conflicts or problems that the party needs to figure out how to solve. Not all of which, or at least for me, I try not to be a punishing TM. So when something happens that's like particularly difficult that I didn't have the intention of putting on the players, I think I feel bad. I think most players probably enjoy the idea of solving the problem. But for me, when the session finished, I was like, oh no, how are they going to continue on? Like, what's their next move? I don't have that figured out for them. Do they just drape a cloak over this 9 foot tall shimmering crystal demon thing? Yeah, so there's still a lot of interesting design choices to be made in regards to the story that is sort of evolves just from the existence of the class.
And I suppose you could run into some issues with that because none of the other classes really have that, like, I guess it maybe depends on setting as well, but most of the other classes are not going to have something that's like, oh, hey, like if you walk into town right now, everybody's going to attack you.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, bad DMs and malicious DMs are always going to find ways to be mean to the players anyway. It's always a thing that's on my mind of like, I don't want this to be put into someone's hands and then used against them. But yeah, it's definitely like I suppose that is maybe one of the difficulties as well. Like as much as a class like Warlock in this class provides a kind of structure for a story, I think many times it can be a like a hindrance, especially if the story that is being told is more focused on something that is external from the not necessarily like each individual party member, but like not external from their abilities. If you have a character in the party that is like the existence of their abilities going to cause problems, I can imagine that being not as fun to play. You know, imagining like a again in the case of the warlock, like you're not mean enough and you have a fiend patron, so they like take away your powers. Like what do you but it's like you're just following the story and like doing the mean things for your fiend patron might feel like derailing or like taking that agency might feel like derailing. Yeah, it's a I there's a interesting conundrum that I think I need to work on.
Have you ever read or played the what is it? Masked? It's like a superhero powered by the apocalypse game.
No, I haven't.
So a little bit of this is reminding me of some of the playbooks or classes that they have there, specifically because a lot of the playbooks that they use are very kind of specific to a like an archetype, like a superhero archetype. And the one to some degree that this reminds me of is the Doomed, where like as you continue going on, like your fate is kind of sealed and like bad things follow you and will ultimately happen to you. So if you wanted some either inspiration or to just kind of look at, an example of that, I think that might be a good place to look, even though it's superhero themed, but maybe of interest.
Yeah, yeah. I'll have to look. Like, yeah, because my only reference right now before the shape changer was a class. It was a I ran this horror campaign at the beginning of the pandemic with some of my friends, and one of the characters' backstories was that they had, or they I don't remember, they were like a tiefling of some like very with lineage that connected to a very evil thing, and the creatures that they were dealing with, the problem that they were dealing with was also very evil and causing a lot of problems. And so the kind of character's arc was giving into these abilities and becoming less and less human in order to solve the problem. But with this other character that I'm running now, or player, their story is so I'll reveal a bit about the what's going on in the setting, because at this point most of the players have discovered it. But within the setting, 60 years ago, there was this occupying empire that just collapsed out of nowhere. It was like going fine, and then it collapsed. And so basically, what had happened is that the god of lies and the influence of that deity had kind of infested the empire, and these crystalline devils were kind of representations of that, and their appearance would be sort of used to stoke fear and division, and the story that went around was that they were representations of the anger of the gods, and so they were called the crystalline hatred. And there are some people who were like taken around the time that they were 10 and given a blood curse to change into these things, where most of these devils were just made purely of crystal and were never human. There's some of them that were human that kind of like infiltrated the empire and helped bring it down. And when it collapsed, everything just kind of disappeared and left the people and the lands that it occupied absent their rulers. But this character escaped. They didn't go down with the ship, and they've been living for 60 years as an elf with this blood curse as an elf with this blood curse. They've been living with this problem and this guilt. And the conflict I'm encountering, that I suppose just because it's only 2 sessions in and I don't necessarily know what to do with it yet, is that everyone knows what a crystalline hatred is, because they've still been around since the fall. They've been in this land for 150 years, and they're causing problems. So everyone like knows more or less what to do with the what's it called? Everyone knows to do what when they see a crystalline hatred, which is to attack it. So I suppose it's like a class that causes, and I suppose that maybe reflecting on it, this is true for many different subclasses, but like perhaps there's a question that needs to be asked before using it of belong in the story. Because what I found is there are a couple of popular subclasses that people use where they don't really fit. Like I have two swashbuckler rogues who are like landlocked, who are both like have backgrounds as pirates. And I'm like, this is a weird kind of form of storytelling. I don't know how to accommodate these. And similar with the Drake Warden Ranger, where I have a number of players who are just like, well, I want to be a Drake Warden. And then that provides a kind of burden on my world building where a lot of cases the Drake Warden doesn't make sense because I have a very complex sort of dragon lore that goes beyond just the kind of metallic and chromatic dragons. So I suppose even, you know, perhaps the question isn't like how do you mitigate the what's it called? How do you mitigate the problems that a class might encounter, but the question might rather just be, is this class or subclass right for the story being told? I think what I'm having a in the moment epiphany of is that question I don't think gets asked a whole lot. I think, you know, because D&D is a set of mechanics first, and the storytelling aspect of D&D is kind of a thing that is shared amongst the community and kind of passed on through like podcasts like this and Matt Colville and these other things. So maybe that should be the focus, this central question of is this right for this story?
Well, I think that even can come down to like the artificers and stuff
Yeah.
too. I mean, that entire class could just not make sense at all
Yeah.
for a given game or theme or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely encounter, and I suppose this really like I the one thing I'm struggling with now right now with having so many players is like I think there is a more or less like common understanding of fantasy in most people's minds as to what it should look like, in which it's kind of like pre-industrial or like post-renaissance, somewhere like in that era, and guns exist and artificers exist, and there's also like a very specific interpretation of how worlds fundamentally work, in which science is a thing alongside magic. And in the case of the artificers, like you have players who make really big assumptions just by the existence of the class and don't like ask it, how it fits or if it fits. And I do have a couple of games where like, you know, artificers are a no-no, but I'll suppose I'd be interested to just get someone else's perspective on it of like, do you encounter that like flavor dissonance?
I will say that I played an artificer in a campaign a while ago. I say campaign, but it was like 3 sessions.
that's that's how most
But it
campaigns
was
go.
but it was definitely like I had flavored everything as technology, right? All of his spells were some sort of technological or physical thing. Like healing would have been like a stim, syringe or something, and firebolt is, shooting a gun essentially, right? So everything is was like technology based, but then we were also in kind of a high magic type world where like I remember one of the scenes we went to like a city center type thing. We were looking for this like politician type person. And it was almost akin to like Harry Potter, where like you talk to the front desk and then they said, okay, we'll send a note to so and so. So they cast a little spell. And then, the note wraps itself up like a paper airplane and goes and flies to whoever's room it is, right? So it's this very weird, like everything that I do is like technology based, but we also live in this world where like common tasks are delegated to magic.
Yeah.
So it felt weird once we got kind of farther in to that. So yes, I have experienced that.
Yeah, that's I think that's something. So I'm someone who thinks like endlessly about like world building logistics in a a high magic world, because like my world, like science does not exist. Science is magic fundamentally. So like like, and to the point where I think about like magical principles that would create or like how okay, I'll just dive into one. There's something that I came up with a while ago that is a principle for designing extremely large buildings called levitational compartmentalization. And essentially it's just a use of the levitate spell on sections of buildings so that the gravity of like the building would not cause it to like collapse in on itself. And also because in like the real world in buildings you have to have like counterweights that when the wind blows, like when an earthquake happens, the building doesn't like just fall over and collapse. And so levitational compartmentalization plays that role, and the principle is simple, again, just casting a levitate spell or enchanting a levitate spell on like large blocks of a building. But then it allows buildings to be very high in a particularly high magic setting, and allows them to sway a little bit without having a structural compromise. So I think that much about like the logistics of world building. And then I have people just showing up in games, not asking a single question, being like, "I have a gun," and I'm like, it's that's not how it would work, though." Yeah, it's definitely a like, I I suppose this really comes around for me to like the idea of buying into a world, and when you are someone who just kind of gives your world to people whoever paying to be in it within reason, it's very hard to communicate the 50 pages of information that exists free floating in my head about the exact logistics of magic and the overlaps of science and interpretations of like fates and everything, and gods. It's yeah, I just find there's a lot of I don't know if there's maybe a piece of advice to go from this rather than just rambling. I think the one thing I'd love to see from players is just for them to ask about like how does this work in the world. That would make my life like hundreds of degrees easier.
Yeah, player buy-in is definitely helpful, and just I guess along with buy-in to just kind of be aware of the world and stuff. And I assume that as you like describe different pieces of the world, that would help because a lot of those things are it really depends on your DM and how much stuff they've put into the world. Because if you're limited on time, then you may not think about a lot of those smaller details and things. So the players may not even know to ask,
Yeah,
you know?
I think that's also because I'm also someone of the principle, despite for most of the last hour going on extended rants and rambles. In most scenarios, and especially for players, I really do not want to overload them with information. Like I could go on extended rants about again like how magic works and how the gods work and how they play their roles in the different forces of the world, and how relationships are developed between like gods and the people who follow them, and what it means to follow a god and things like that. These are all like very relevant things to a lot of the games I'm running that I would love to just sit all 70 some of my players down and be like, here's how it works. But also I think there is a principle or truth or something in that players are only going to learn as much as they are interested in, as they're curious for. And I think there is a I think, amongst, many things that I think are present in a conversation around the D&D community, I think player curiosity is something that I don't think I've ever really seen mentioned, and I think would go a long way, because there are definitely players I have that are wonderful. Like I had this incredible moment of a player paying attention and calling back. I so literally probably 70 sessions ago, not in the same game, but I had run probably around 70 to 80 sessions between the game that incited this event and the game that recently happened where this player kind of ratified a piece of world building. But basically, the story is that this cult was trying to summon a powerful thing into the world in order to fight a worse thing by massacring a bunch of people. The party realized what was going on because they were part of that people who were potentially getting massacred, and they stopped it, but at the consequence of now this horrible thing is still in the world, and nothing has come to deal with it. And one of the players had messaged me about wanting to have a sort of like fall from grace arc for their paladin. And so basically they had come to a place in this apocalyptic setting where there happens to be a lot of people who are all basically like refugees from hell. And there's this really, really tragic moment for the character where he was like, well, cool, my God has failed me. But I remember the words that were used in this ritual when these people were being massacred. So, party, you guys go on ahead. You scout out the tomb that we're going to. Me and my NPC brother are going to stick around and just keep watch. And then they did a horrible thing, but remembered or wrote down the words that I had kind of wrote down as a like, one and done. I'm never gonna think about this again. But when he like said them, it was like as I take my sword out and go to approach doing this horrible thing, I speak these words, and I was like, oh my God, oh my God, like it's such a gratifying feeling when someone does like honor the world building and like has and like kind of like feels when you have a character that actually feels like they live in the very complex world that you have created. I don't even know like how to describe, or if there's something to learn from that. I just like that feeling was amazing, and I wish that more players knew what to do in order to get there.
It's a really cool story, and yeah, I would say that that's probably not necessarily always an easy thing for players or for DMs to try and like set up moments like that,
Yeah.
right? That's kind of a natural consequence of having invested players, and
Yeah, and I
yeah,
think
I don't know what else I'm trying to
yeah.
say.
And I think it's also a matter of like, because I run a very specific kind of game, even sandbox game. Given the nature of how I run my settings, and in that any given setting, there's at least two other parties in there with you. There's a lot more freedom for players to pursue the most interesting thing for them. So there's this real sense that I try to encourage amongst my players of agency, of like, the story is in your hands, you are leading it. I am not going to push you anywhere. But I think that's a very difficult thing for people to grasp, because obviously like games just regularly can be so complicated. I had, or I'm still having, in my big setting, two groups are crossing over. They've had like 3 or 4 weeks, or maybe even 5 weeks of crossover sessions where their parties are in the same place, so the players are showing up in each other's campaigns. And I think, I suppose the thing that I've been having to wrestle with is in the absence of a forced structure or a more concise structure that, still for most people would have some leeway for the players to be creative. In the total absence of a structure that I have personally planned out for each group, how do you get a party to tell a story? And the one thing I noticed of, for example, I had a session with like 8 players, like a role play session, and we kind of had, a limited amount of time because I also needed events to happen in the session. And within like the first hour, the players, the characters were just like kind of talking to each other and like kind of not like having necessarily like trivial in a bad way, but like having trivial conversations that like didn't relate to the story. And I was like, oh no, this is going to be a big problem. But I've come up with I think a solution that generally I would hope help people. And the moment I have some time to work on it, which could be today, which is creating a sort of like document to outline the story that is being told. Like, because I oftentimes I'll in a session I'll take time to check in with a player or the group and say, what does your character think about this thing, in an attempt to try to get them to initiate a role play scene. I tend not to want to force my players together to talk about something, but oftentimes the players have a difficult time like keeping a grasp on like what is of the story, or what is the point of the thing that they are doing in a role play sense. Like they know like the next objective, but in an improvisational story, oftentimes when people exist in their own lives, the through line of the character can get lost. So I have this idea to sort of create a document that's like inciting events, arcs, themes, or basically like outlines for characters to reference where they're coming from and where they're going and how it relates to their story or this arc or whatever. But I suppose that's really the but I'm gonna stop myself there. The point of that being, I have this like solution that I find really hopefully to be effective that I'll be implementing soon.
Cool. Well, we are getting about to time, so this would be a great time for you to plug your socials and where people can find.
Absolutely. Most places I am Jesse T. William. TikTok, on Instagram, on Twitter, I believe. Also, it would be wonderful if people could check out my Patreon and hopefully use these monsters that I've created and give some feedback. And yeah, that is where I can be found.
Awesome, Jesse. Well, it was great having you back up.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Dungeon Master's Toolkit podcast. You can find links to all of the products and resources that we talked about on the show in the show notes. And if you'd like to join the community or find out how to be on the show, check out our subreddit or join us in our Discord server.